At 2 in the morning, the phone rang. I was already awake. Sleep no longer often visits those who carry so many hidden silences. When I heard the dry, insistent sound, my heart didn't race. It merely confirmed what I already knew. That day had arrived. I picked up the phone with trembling but steady hands. On the other end, the voice of Joshua, my grandson, came muffled by tears and fear. "Grandma, it happened." He found out everything. For a second, the world stopped. But not in surprise, in certainty. What I had feared for years was now real. I closed my eyes. The darkness of my room seemed to swallow me, but something inside me flared. I got up slowly, without turning on the light. I went to the back of the closet, knelt, and pulled out the old iron drawer, the one no one remembered anymore. The metal creaked as if protesting so many years of neglect. Inside, beneath yellowed letters and a faded ribbon, was the key. The key my late husband gave me shortly before he died. The key he made me promise to keep until the inevitable happened. As I held her, I felt the weight of the years, the injustices, the unspoken words, and the silent betrayals. And then I whispered, "Now it begins. You won't believe what my own son was capable of doing. My own flesh and blood. The same one to whom I gave my life, my sleepless nights, my last pennies. He planned it all, for years. He waited for me to grow old, weak, and alone. He used false documents, alliances with corrupt lawyers, dirty lies. He managed to remove my name from the house my husband and I built with so much sacrifice. And more than that, he put Joshua, the only grandson who still visits me, in danger. All out of ambition. Out of greed. When Joshua tried to investigate, confront, seek the truth, he was threatened. Kicked out of his own home. No money, no support. My grandson, my good boy. And now, in his early 20s, he already tastes the betrayal coming from within his own family. The taste I know so well. But what he didn't know, and what my son could never have imagined, is that I never forgot what my husband told me. And that key is the only thing that can change the game. It's not just for me. It's for my dignity. For my husband's memory. For the justice that never came. And for Joshua, who won't carry alone the shame of a family that lost its way. I kept everything. Every paper. Every conversation. Every secret they pretended I was too old to understand. Now, it's my turn. By the way, if this story has made you feel anything, anger, sadness, a desire to know more, subscribe to the channel and comment where you watch from. This helps me continue telling these stories that many people prefer to hide. Because what comes next? No one is prepared. Not even him. I put on my wool coat and walked down the stairs in silence, as I had done for decades in that house. But this time, it wasn't to make coffee. It was to open doors my son thought were locked forever. I was forgotten alive. And I don't say this with bitterness. I say it with the clarity of someone who has seen, with their own eyes, time erase my name from my family's history. 74 years of life, a widow for 15, and all that remains is an old kettle, a creaking radio, and the living room window, where I spend hours watching the world go by, without anyone noticing I'm still here. After my husband passed away, I thought my children would take turns being by my side. That they would miss the smell of freshly baked cake, the stories at the dinner table, the security only a mother can give. But what happened was something else. They housed me in this old house, the same one Robert and I renovated with the little we had, and then disappeared. Everyone went on with their lives. Everyone made excuses. The oldest, David, only shows up when he needs money, which I no longer have. The middle child, Clarissa, lives a few blocks away and never has time. The youngest became a picture in a frame that never leaves its place. None of them asked if I needed anything. None of them wanted to know if I felt lonely. And I did. Very much. The only one who still remembered me was Joshua, my grandson. The only one who called on Sundays. The one who stopped by after work just to have tea and hear the same stories his parents insisted on forgetting. Yes, looked at me as a person. But even that was hanging by a thread. Last week, Clarissa said to me, with that icy smile she'd learned somewhere, "Mom, it's time to think about a nursing home. A place that really cares for you." As if I were a cracked vase no one wanted in the middle of the living room anymore. As if everything I'd experienced was worthless. I didn't answer. I just got up, went to the kitchen, and poured the tea. But inside me, something snapped. And here's a warning, they think old age weakens. That silence is a sign of surrender. But they forgot that I also had an intelligent husband, who taught me a lot before he left. They forgot a secret I kept for years. One detail, one piece of paper, one key. One thing that could change the entire game. They don't know it. But everything is about to change. By the way, if this story has ever touched you, if it reminded you of your mother, your grandmother, or even your own story, take advantage now and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every word with care. And knowing that someone is still listening changes everything. Finally, on that cold morning, after another sleepless night, I got up slowly, went to the room no one had entered in years, and opened the closet. Beneath the old sheets and forgotten albums, there it was. The key. The one no one remembers anymore. The one I promised I'd only use when there was no turning back. And when Joshua called me, desperate, saying, "Grandma, it happened," I knew the time had come. When Joshua hung up the phone that morning, and I stood there holding that cold key in my hands, for a moment everything around me seemed suspended. The house was plunged into a thick darkness, but it wasn't just an absence of light, it was an absence of life. It had long since stopped echoing with laughter, hurried footsteps, or voices calling out to me. Now, only the creak of antique furniture and the ticking of a forgotten clock filled the void. It was as if each object held memories I no longer knew whether they were mine or those of another woman I had been. My name is Eleanor. 74 years old. Widowed. Mother of 3. Grandmother of 1. At least, of one who still remembers I exist. Joshua. My boy. He still calls, even if it's only once a week. And it always starts the same way. "Hi, Grandma. How are you today?" I lie. "I'm fine, honey." But the truth is, it's been years since I felt truly well. After my husband left, the house became a museum. The children, so eager to move on with their lives, promised me visits, phone calls, family weekends. Beautiful promises. Until time passed and affection turned into commitment. And commitment became a nuisance. First came the excuses. Too much work, the kids with fevers, the dangerous road. Then, the silence. A kind of elegant abandonment, clothed in justifications. I became a weight too light to be remembered, but too heavy to carry. Today, that house smells of old tea, dusty books, and memories. Every corner holds a piece of the woman I once was. The kitchen where I prepared Sunday lunches. The worn armchair where my husband quietly read the Psalms. The living room window, my new meeting place with the world. It's there that I spend hours. Sitting. Waiting for. What? A car that never arrives. A voice that never calls. A doorbell that never rings. Silence has become my only friend. And even that, sometimes, tires me. Poor Joshua tries to fill that void. But he's still young. He's trying to understand the world, find his place. Little does he know he's caught up in a game that began long before he was born. A dirty game of power, vanity, and greed. My eldest son, my firstborn, always had a charming demeanor. The kind everyone loves at first sight. But behind the smile was something more. Something I chose to ignore. For years, I thought a mother's love was enough to shape character. Today I know that blind love doesn't teach. It only delays the impact of truth. He was the one who started it all. Driven by ambition, he devised a silent plot. He used documents, lies, and influence. While I cared for my grandchildren, made coffee for visitors, and even donated part of my retirement, He worked to erase my name from the history I helped build. Joshua found out by accident. He found files in the office and overheard conversations. And when he tried to question him, the first threat came, "Stay out of this, kid. This is none of your business." But Joshua is made of different clay. He feels the weight of right and wrong. And even though he was trembling, he called me. It was at that moment that I knew. I could no longer hide behind my age, nor my pain. I needed to use everything I had left. My memory, my courage, and that key, to rewrite the ending of this story. I was no longer fighting just for myself. I was fighting for him, for everything that represents innocence and loyalty. The truth is, aging hasn't made me fragile. It's just made me invisible. But invisibility isn't weakness. It's just the perfect disguise for those who observe, listen, and wait. Behind the silence, there's strategy. There's determination. There's fire stored in cold ashes. That dawn reminded me of who I was. Not the lady with slow steps and tired eyes, but the woman who survived war, loss, sleepless nights. The woman who learned to wait for the right moment. And now, the moment has arrived. The key in my hands wasn't just an old object. It was a code. An answer. A call to action. With her, I would descend into the depths of truth. And what I would find there would change everything. 2 days before that early morning call, Joshua had come here. It was a short visit, the kind that arrives with the body already leaving. He entered slowly, shouldering his backpack like someone carrying more than books and headphones. There was something in his gaze that took me back in time. A mixture of fear and urgency that only appears when the soul knows more than the mouth can explain. "Hi, Grandma," he said, hugging me quickly but tightly. I could feel his bones. He was thin, tired. And it wasn't the kind of tiredness a night's sleep can cure. It was something else, a deeper kind. As if he'd seen something he shouldn't have, heard something that had never been said aloud. I sat with him on the porch. It was late afternoon. The sky was beginning to turn rusty, and the light streaming through the curtains cast shadows on the living room furniture. I made him the chamomile tea he always loved, but he didn't even touch the cup. He sat there, fiddling with his fingers on the edge of the table, his eyes lowered, and that tight silence between us. "Grandma, did Grandpa leave a notebook, or keep documents somewhere hidden?" he asked suddenly. It was dry, direct, as if he'd rehearsed the phrase 1,000 times before opening his mouth. I froze. My eyes must have blinked faster than usual, because he noticed. I hid it. "Why, my son?" I tried to smile, but my voice was shaky. He shrugged. He said he'd heard things. That perhaps his grandfather had left some instruction, some clue. He talked about inheritance, about names in deeds. Things that seemed too big to fit into those single words he released slowly, carefully. But there, in that instant, a piece of the puzzle fell into place inside me. My son, Joshua's father, had begun to move his claws again. And now, Joshua, unbeknownst to him, was right at the center of it all. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to open my mouth and say, "Yes, your grandfather left me something. A key. A secret. A hidden truth that could change everything." But I remained silent. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of protective instinct. Or maybe because it wasn't time yet. Joshua needed more than harsh truths. He needed proof. Strength. Preparation. So I just shook my head, said I didn't know anything, and changed the subject. I talked about the plants in the garden, the soap operas I no longer watch, the cake that was still in the oven even though it wasn't. Joshua pretended to believe it. But his eyes said something else. As we said goodbye, he hugged me tighter than last time. We stayed there a little longer than usual. And when he walked away before opening the gate, he turned to me with a half smile and whispered, "If anything happens, I'll call you." And then he was gone, leaving in the air a taste of the past and of foreboding. In that moment, the world slowed down. Everything seemed to fall into absolute silence. The kind of silence that heralds change, transformation, an invisible but irreversible turning point. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, the light dim, the phone nearby, and the key in my head. Yes, even without having touched it yet, it was already there. I felt the call. My intuition was beating strongly, like a clock without hands, warning me that the time was coming. I replayed every conversation I had with my husband in the months before he passed. I remembered the times he'd start to say something and stop mid-sentence, as if afraid the walls would overhear him. I remembered the day he handed me a sealed brown envelope and said, "Don't open this until there's no more doubt." I kept everything. Even the tone of his voice. Even the trembling of his hands. Because I knew that one day it would come back to find me. Joshua was right to ask. And even without knowing the full answer, he already carried part of the story. It was as if, somehow, he knew there was something behind that facade of a well-organized family. Something hidden in the background of our lives, waiting to be revealed. After that visit, everything began to change. Small things that had previously gone unnoticed began to take on meaning. A missed call. A neighbor who made a strange comment. A piece of lost mail. Signs. Fragments. Clues I'd previously ignored out of complacency or weariness now lined up before me like an ancient map, and the key, somewhere, was the missing piece. I didn't yet know exactly what I would find, but I knew that, when I turned the key, everything buried would come to light. And when the truth emerges, it doesn't always come alone. It brings consequences, scars, decisions that can no longer be postponed. The journey was just beginning, but the destination was already visible. And I knew that once I took the next step, there would be no turning back. It was on a gray morning, one of those that seems to start already defeated, that the truth hit me with the force of a revelation postponed for years. I received a letter, strangely formal, with my full name printed on the envelope. I thought it was just another government document, the kind that only serves to take up space on the desk. But as soon as I opened it, I knew nothing would be the same. The language was cold, technical, but the impact was immediate. An official document, signed by a notary I'd never set foot in, stated that part of the property, the same one I'd lived in for over 40 years, now belonged to someone else. A strange name. A name I didn't recognize, until I turned the page and saw the second surname. It was that of my eldest son's wife. An early gift, supposedly given during my late husband's lifetime. But I knew that man. I knew his values, his attention to every detail. My husband would never do something like that without talking to me. He would never hide it. And there, in that moment, the already fragile ground beneath my feet crumbled. They forged his signature. They changed dates. They created stories. They erased my existence with pen ink and authentication stamps. I froze. My heart pounded as if it wanted to escape my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but anger shook my hands. I thought about Joshua. He was right to be worried. He'd already sensed all of this. But when I called to tell him, the phone just rang. The next day, I went to his house. I knocked. No one answered. I waited on the sidewalk, sitting on the step, for almost an hour. The neighbor, a woman with dyed hair and an all-observant air, came out and said she'd seen him leave in a hurry the day before, backpack on. He looked nervous, she said. He didn't even look back. And I knew, right then and there, Joshua was in danger. He knew too much. And now, he was missing. I returned home with an empty stomach, and an even more empty soul. I sat on the same sofa where I'd rocked all my children when they were little. Where I'd sung lullabies, where I'd told them made-up stories just to see their eyes light up. Now, that sofa was my refuge from grief. I hugged the cushions as if they still held the scent of the childhood I'd fought so hard to preserve. And I cried. Alone. I tried calling my other children. One of them hung up on me, saying he was very busy. The other listened in silence and responded with, "Mom, you're overreacting. Maybe you're confusing things." And that's when I heard, for the first time, the words that cut deeper than any dagger. The old lady is getting confused. Confused. It was as if my right to be lucid had been stripped away. As if growing old automatically meant losing my mind. And I, who had always been the foundation, who held the fort together when everything fell apart, was now treated like an emotional burden. An outdated, disposable figure. I wanted to scream. I wanted to knock on their door and show them the documents. I wanted to show them the calloused hands that had supported that family. I wanted them to feel the pain of being ignored. But what I did was go back to the couch. And there I stayed. 4 hours. Day turned to night and I didn't even notice. I kept thinking about all the times I'd neglected to do something for myself in order to do something for them. How many clothes I'd neglected to buy, how many dreams I'd suppressed, how much pain I'd silenced to keep the house together. And now, not even my name was mine anymore. But through the tears, something in me began to shift. A thread of indignation began to transform into strength. Not that explosive, noisy strength. It was a quiet, almost ancestral strength. The strength of someone who has been discredited but carries the truth in their heart. An energy that arises when you realize no one else will fight for you, so you decide to fight for yourself. It was at that moment, between sobs and memories, that my gaze fell on the bookshelf. Among the dusty picture frames, one was crooked. I stood up to straighten it, and behind it, I saw a letter. Aged, sealed with red ribbon. The name handwritten, Eleanor. It was his. And then, everything changed again. The sound of the phone breaking the silence of the house at 2 in the morning didn't startle me. Not that time. Because my body was already awake even before the ring. As if a part of me knew that this early morning wouldn't be like the others. I simply reached out, answered, and heard heavy breathing on the other end. Then, Joshua's voice, low, filled with fear, as if hidden somewhere even he couldn't explain. It happened, Grandma. He threatened me. I found it. I found what he was hiding. There was no time for questions. No explanations. Just that phrase that pierced me like a blade. He threatened me. I knew exactly who that he was. And what he was capable of, I could no longer ignore. I rose from the chair with the firmness of someone who has just realized they no longer have the luxury of hesitation. The urgency was now real. And the fear, irrelevant. I went to my room, hurriedly put on my slippers, and walked straight to the old cabinet. The one no one opened anymore. The one that had been forgotten over time, like so many other pieces of my history. The iron was rusty, and the lock was heavy. I grabbed the key I always kept inside an empty medicine chest. No one would ever suspect. The sound of the lock unlocking seemed louder than it should have been, as if the cabinet itself was warning me. You're about to see what you've preferred to keep hidden for so long. Upon opening it, the smell of old paper mixed with mold and memories filled the air. Inside lay a battered brown folder, tied with frayed string. Beneath it lay a handful of old photos, some burned at the edges, as if someone had tried unsuccessfully to erase the memories. And finally a smaller envelope, with my handwriting immediately recognizable, for when it all falls apart. I sat up in bed, my heart no longer beating fast. It was pounding heavily, like a drum announcing a rite of passage. I opened the envelope with steady hands. Inside was a handwritten note, in my husband's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. That crooked but sure handwriting. The paper was already yellowed, the edges creased, but the words, they burned like new fire. Eleanor. If you're reading this, it's because what I feared has happened. I tried to warn our son, I tried to show him another way, but he chose to ignore it all. The power, the control, the inheritance, he wants it all. And he'll do whatever it takes to get it. You've always been the strongest among us. Always. I've kept documents, records, copies of conversations, and bank accounts he tried to erase. There's also a signed power of attorney. You need to protect Joshua. He's not like his father. And he'll need you. Don't trust anyone, Eleanor. Just do what's right. With love. Henry. Rereading his name at the end was like receiving a hug from the past. But not a hug of comfort, a hug of strength. The kind that reminds us of who we truly are when the world tries to convince us otherwise. I picked up the folder. I sat back on the couch, the same one where days before I'd cried silently. But this time, the emotion was different. It wasn't pain. It was determination. A kind of clarity that only comes when everything that was blurry finally reveals itself clearly. The papers inside had dates, stamps, signatures, but they also had stories. Behind-the-scenes decisions, lies cloaked in formality, traces left in the certainty no one would find. But Henry found them. And he kept them all. For me. For Joshua. It was a hidden timeline, revealing how power corrupts even the blood. How a man can use his mother's love as a shield to hide his own crimes. How the truth can be hidden for years, but never forever. It wasn't just about the house. It wasn't just about money. It was about legacy. About responsibility. About decisions that shape not only the present, but what will come after us. It was about transforming the cycle. Stopping the repetition. Protecting the next generation from bearing the consequences of the choices of those who came before. Joshua didn't know it yet, but he had just been thrust into the center of a story that began before he was born. And I, now with the truth in my hands, knew what I needed to do. This wasn't the time to seek revenge. It was time to build justice. Not the kind found in courtrooms. The kind that awakens conscience and makes each person pay exactly the price for what they tried to hide. The sound of dawn outside was the same, but inside me, something had changed. A new mindset was taking hold. One of someone who no longer waited for permission to act. One who understood that no matter how much they push you into a corner, when you decide to react, even the past begins to work in your favor. I put the folder away, folded the letter carefully, and stood. Joshua needed to know. But before any conversation, there was one last place I needed to go. One last detail that could tie it all together. The piece that might explain not only what happened, but why it still hurt so much. When I put the letter back in the folder, something inside me had already aligned. As if the pieces, until then scattered within me, had finally fallen into place. That sentence written by Henry, "Protect Joshua," wasn't just a request. It was a summons. A passing of the baton. He knew that when that moment came, I would have to choose between remaining the woman silenced in the corners of the house or rising up with the weight of an entire history to carry and transform. In the morning, my eyes still heavy from a bad night's sleep, I called an old acquaintance of Henry's. A discreet lawyer, the kind who speaks little but listens attentively. I didn't know where to begin, so I got straight to the point. I told him everything. The letter, the documents, the threat to Joshua, the part of the house they had transferred without my consent. On the other end of the line, silence. Then, just one sentence. "This needs to be considered calmly, but there are things here that could change everything." That gave me a breather. Over the next few days, I delved into the paperwork. There were contracts, receipts, bank statements, and most importantly, transfers made in the name of third parties. People who weren't family members but who, according to Henry, were trustworthy. He had divided the properties to protect them. Not out of distrust of me, but out of fear for his own son. And that, for me, hurt more than any betrayal. Knowing that the man I loved and with whom I built my life died with this fear in his chest. Silently. Alone. Joshua, when I finally managed to speak to him again, listened silently. He was dejected, but attentive. When I finished, he took a deep breath and said, "Then we'll go all the way, Grandma. Together." And there was what I needed. It wasn't just the presence of someone by my side. It was confirmation that there was still a future in that house. There was still an emotional legacy. And I don't mean possessions, money, or property. I mean the truth. The legacy of integrity that Henry tried to preserve. Our plan began almost clandestinely. We met discreetly, reviewed each document, and wrote everything down. Joshua helped with the digital files, cross-referencing information, searching for names that appeared between the lines. He had a quick, curious mind. And, above all, a fair one. This filled me with pride. Because deep down, despite everything, he was the result of what I once planted in my family. Even though the branches had strayed, a root still held. I began to understand that my story wasn't a burden. It was a tool. What they did to me, the devaluation, the abandonment, the attempted erasure, all of it was only powerful because I had forgotten who I was. But now, rediscovering hidden details of Henry's life, understanding the behind-the-scenes of what he faced alone, a new mindset was taking hold within me. There was no longer room for fear or doubt. There was only clarity. I wasn't weak. I was just forgotten. It's curious how memory can be a weapon. While they were counting on my confusion, I was mentally reorganizing everything. I remembered dates, meetings, conversations over Sunday lunch that everyone, except me, had forgotten. I remembered Henry's hurried trips, the envelopes he hid inside books on the shelf, the times I'd seen him write letters and hide them in the lining of a drawer. He knew someone would need these clues one day. The hardest part was accepting that the enemy wasn't external. It was my own blood. It hurts in a way no one can describe. Because you don't expect destruction to come from someone you've given everything to. But this pain, instead of paralyzing me, began to shape me. Like fire purifying metal. It made me stronger. More aware. More myself. Joshua suggested we record everything. Not to post, but to keep a record. In case something happens, Grandma, we need proof. At first, I hesitated. The idea of exposing so much still bothered me. But then I realized it wasn't exposure. It was protection. It was a testament to our journey. And more than that, it was preparation for when the truth came out. Because it would. Sooner or later. With each passing day, the investigation took us deeper. We discovered accounts opened in the names of front men, transactions made shortly before Henry's death, visits to the notary's office on dates coinciding with my absences. Everything was calculated. And, ironically, this organization was what helped us piece together the puzzle. My son's every move left a trail. And the more I tried to erase it, the clearer it all became. It was during this process that I realized how much a decision, made in silence, can impact generations. Henry's choice to hide everything rather than confront our son directly wasn't cowardice. It was strategy. And now, it was up to me to make that effort worthwhile. To make sense of it all. And to protect Joshua. Not just physically, but spiritually. To preserve in him the notion of justice, dignity, and honor. Things that aren't inherited by name, but by attitude. There was still much to do. But for the first time in a long time, I felt in control. Not out of revenge, but out of justice. Because a story like ours couldn't end in silence. It needed to be heard. And most importantly, it needed to be understood. I can't explain exactly what happened that Sunday, but it was as if I'd woken up in a different skin. The face in the mirror was still the same, deep-set wrinkles, deep-set eyes, hair already surrendered to the test of time. But behind the reflection was something new. A drive. A different energy. Maybe it was the weight of Henry's letter, maybe Joshua's eyes, or perhaps the simple fact of rediscovering my own name among forgotten papers. All I know is that on that day something inside me said, enough. I left home early, with the morning wind still chilly and the city slowly waking up. I stopped by the barber shop on the corner, the one I'd always eyed with curiosity but never entered. A young man greeted me with a shy smile. "What are we doing today, Ms. Eleanor?" I took a deep breath and replied without hesitation. "I want to cut my hair. Really short. I want to see myself like no one else has." As he cut, the strands fell to the floor like fragments of a past that no longer belonged to me. Each strand was a memory left behind. Each movement of the scissors, a step forward. And when he swiveled the chair and I saw my face with that modern, light, firm cut, I smiled. Not a smile of vanity, but of rediscovery. That was me. Finally back to myself. From that day on, everything began to change. I started walking the neighborhood streets every morning. People looked at me differently. I don't know if it was my hair, my posture, or the simple fact that I now walked with purpose. I became that woman who walks in a hurry, as if on a mission. And, in a way, that's exactly what I was. I began visiting notary offices. I rummaged through archives, requested certificates, and dug up old deeds. I reconnected with past contacts, Henry's old friends, churchmates, even that quiet accountant who always attended Sunday lunches but never said a word. One by one, everyone added information, documents, dates, names. And as the network grew, the picture of my son's deeds became clearer. A trail of greed carefully woven over the years. But now, under the right supervision, it began to unravel. The most impressive thing was seeing how their faces changed when they saw me arriving. Some with surprise, others with discomfort. As if no one expected me to be there. Firm, lucid, with folders in hand and sharp questions on the tip of my tongue. "Do you really want to open this case?" they asked me. And I always answered the same way. "I don't want to. I'm going." Joshua, without my asking, began recording everything. He discreetly recorded conversations, saved the audio, and made copies of the paperwork. He created digital folders and organized everything precisely. It was as if he knew that, at some point, this would be necessary. And not just as legal evidence, but as testimony. Because this story, as it was being woven, was bigger than the two of us. It was about transformation. About identity. About the courage to break the silence even when the world expects you to remain silent. He'd say, "Grandma, this is much more than a lawsuit. It's a story no one has ever told, because people like you are always relegated to the background." And I understood what he meant. Because for a long time, accepting the role of the silent woman seemed easier. It was comfortable not to confront. It was safe not to stir old wounds. But there comes a time when silence weighs more heavily than conflict. And it was with this mindset that I began to act. Not as a victim, but as a protagonist. Not to cause a scandal, but to reclaim what was mine, and what was ours. Because what was at stake wasn't just a house or a piece of land. What was at stake was Henry's name, the memory of our history, and Joshua's future. I started wearing different clothes. Nothing over the top. Just colors I'd usually avoided. A light lipstick, an antique necklace, a pair of low-heeled sandals. Things that seemed small, but together they screamed to the world, "I'm still here." And more than that, I'm awake. Some friends from church called me, surprised. "Eleanor, we hear you're dealing with serious stuff." To which I replied, calmly but firmly, "It's serious stuff. It's my life." The most curious thing was realizing that the more I moved, the more the people around me revealed their true selves. Those who underestimated me began to distance themselves. Those who admired me approached me in silence. And those who feigned neutrality began to show discomfort. It was as if my transformation forced them to confront their own cowardice. But I no longer had time for that. My days were now full. Meetings, records, discoveries. Every step I took revealed another layer of a truth that, for too long, had been buried under the weight of familiar convenience. And as painful as it was to face certain revelations, it was even more liberating to know that I had finally stopped being just a pawn in someone else's game. I was playing now. With my cards. With my voice. And with a strength I didn't even know still existed. And even though the road ahead still promised difficult battles, I already understood that the stakes were much higher than a lawsuit. It was about breaking the cycle. Once and for all. It was a sunny Tuesday when everything came to a head. I was returning from the market, bags slung over my arms, when I saw my neighbor across the street watching me from the balcony with a strange expression. Not her usual, contained curiosity, but something between surprise and discomfort. I didn't pay much attention. I went inside, put away my groceries, and turned on the kettle. And it was only when I sat down with a cup of tea that Joshua arrived, his face more serious than ever, holding his cell phone pointed at me. "Look at this, Grandma." The headline wasn't sensationalist. It was dry, raw, surgical. Full name. Photo. Formal accusation. Document fraud. Misappropriation of funds. Ongoing investigation. And right below, the part that hurt the most, accused of threatening his own nephew to cover up evidence. My son. The same one who once ran around the yard with scraped knees and hands full of ants. Now, plastered across the headlines as a cold, calculating, and violent man. I read it all. Paragraph by paragraph. I could feel the tea growing cold in my hand, but I couldn't stop. The details matched everything we discovered. The dates, the names, the records. Each piece fitting into a puzzle we'd begun to piece together alone, silently, when no one else believed. Joshua said nothing. He just sat there, watching my reaction. I didn't cry either. I didn't tremble. I didn't curse. I just breathed. For the first time with relief. Because the truth, finally, was out of the shadows. And now, it had a face, a name, and a voice. It was no longer a stifled suspicion. It was real. And it was public. In the following days, the commotion was intense. Journalists began to prowl the street. Some tried to speak to me. I knocked gently but firmly on the door. This wasn't a spectacle. This was justice. The family, as expected, was in despair. Phone calls came one after the other. At first, cold. Then, heated. Then, tearful. "Do you want to destroy your own son?" they asked. But no one asked me what he destroyed first. The most curious thing was the parade of unexpected visitors. People who hadn't come to my door in years. People who judged me, who believed the lies, who distanced themselves out of convenience. Everyone now came with downcast eyes and rehearsed words. "We didn't know anything, Eleanor. If we'd known what you were going through. Your son always had a way of convincing everyone." I listened to it all, patiently, with a half smile. But inside, there was no bitterness. There was recognition. Many people think that growing older means losing importance. But what no one tells you is that time, when lived well, gives you something no youth can: perspective. And with perspective comes discernment. You learn to listen not only to what is said, but also to what is said. You learn to recognize those who only approach you when they smell a downfall. And those who were there even when everything seemed like meaningless chaos. The newspapers continued to cover the case. With each story, more evidence emerged. And the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that my son's castle had been built on quicksand. With stacked lies, forged documents, and relationships bought. The image he'd cultivated for years, that of the exemplary, successful family man, was crumbling. Slowly. But with no chance of rebuilding. One night, as Joshua and I were reviewing yet another batch of documents and case updates, he stopped and asked me, "Grandma, do you think he really feels guilty?" I was silent for a few seconds. It wasn't a simple question. And it wasn't the first time I'd thought about it. I wish I could say yes. That there was a shred of conscience inside. But the truth is, sometimes ambition corrodes in a way that leaves no room for guilt. Only for the fear of losing control. And that's what he was feeling now. Panic at having been unmasked. "Maybe he doesn't feel guilty yet," I replied. "But he feels he lost. And for someone like him, that hurts more than any regret." Joshua nodded slightly. And in that moment, I understood that our journey was no longer just about evidence, trials, or legal justice. It was about liberation. About ending a cycle of silence, manipulation, and devaluation. It was about making it clear that no one, at any age, should accept being pushed to the margins of their own story. There was still much to be said. The consequences would come in waves. Some predictable, some surprising. But I was ready. Not as the tired, forgotten old woman they tried to portray, but as the woman reborn from her own pain, and who now walked not to prove anything to others, but to honor what she knew to be right, with every fiber of her being, and with every memory of her soul. The call came on a cloudy afternoon. I was organizing papers in the corner of the living room when the landline rang, the one almost no one uses anymore, but which I stubbornly keep. I answered unhurriedly. The voice on the other end was professional, emotionless. She identified herself as a nurse from the Central Hospital. She gave my son's name. She said he had suffered a mild stroke, that he was conscious but disoriented, and that, until that moment, no one in the family had arrived. I was silent for a moment, not for lack of reaction, but for an overflow of thoughts. It was as if all the memories, pains, and choices of the past few years had come crashing down inside me at once. And there, amidst the paperwork that held our exposed truths, the news felt like the inevitable chapter in a story that had long been waiting for an end. Joshua arrived minutes later. I didn't need to explain anything. I just showed him the note with the hospital address. He looked at me with that quiet look he'd learned when he realized some decisions are made with a quiet heart, and that's what we did. We left without saying much. The city seemed slower that day. The drive to the hospital was silent, but the car was full of everything that was never said. When we entered the room, he was lying down, his eyes closed, wires attached to his body, and a monitor beeping softly. The man who tried to erase me was there. Vulnerable. Empty. For the first time in years, I saw my son without a shield. Without disguise. Without the weight of arrogance in his gaze. Just skin, exhaustion, and a shadow of fear in the depths of his eyes when he noticed my presence. Joshua stood in the doorway. He didn't enter immediately. I, on the other hand, walked calmly to the side of the bed. Not out of coldness, but out of clarity. I sat in the chair and waited for him to say something. It was long minutes before he finally opened his mouth, with difficulty. "You won." His voice was low, choked, as if each word was labored. I could have responded in 1,000 ways. I could have scoffed, questioned, broken down. But I did none of those things. I simply held his hand, not affectionately, but humanely. And I replied. I didn't fight to win. I fought to survive. He turned his face away. He looked out the window. There was a tear trapped in the corner of his eye, but it didn't fall. Maybe out of pride, maybe because he no longer had the strength. And in that moment, I realized what had truly brought me here. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't confrontation. It was ending a cycle. It was looking in the eyes of what had hurt me so much and, even so, choosing not to harbor hatred. We stayed like that for a few minutes. I sat beside him, feeling the symbolic weight of that room. Joshua, now beside me, silent, watching everything with the wisdom of someone who understands that some reunions aren't about reconciliation, but about closure. I could have said so many things. Reminded me of every humiliation, every lie, every attempt to make me look crazy or fragile. But I said none of that. Because in that moment, he already knew. And knowing, sometimes, is punishment enough. The silence between us wasn't cold. It was necessary. It was as if time were respecting that silent farewell to everything we were, everything we lost, everything that could have been. I knew that from then on, nothing would ever be the same again. And that's okay. Some stories don't need to be rewritten, they just need to be closed with dignity. I got up from the chair, still holding his hand. I squeezed it lightly and simply said, "May you find peace." It wasn't a forgiveness. It was a liberation. Mine. His. And perhaps from all the ghosts that still haunted our names. When I left the room, Joshua walked me silently to the car. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a lightness I'd never known. As if the weight of decades had slipped from my shoulders, leaving only scarred skin and a peaceful heart. Not because everything was resolved, but because, finally, I decided to stop carrying what no longer belongs to me. In the days following that encounter in the hospital, life seemed to move at a new pace. As if, after so much accumulated weight, time had learned to move more lightly through the rooms of my house. The air felt different. No longer the heavy silence that had haunted me for years, but a profound calm. The kind of stillness that only comes when the truth has been told, even if it hurts. Joshua, always discreet, called me late one afternoon. His voice carried a mixture of relief and care. He said the process had been completed. That everything that belonged to his grandfather, by right and choice, was now officially his. The properties, the investments protected in the name of third parties, the hidden documents, the recovered records, all legally recognized. No more disputes. No more uncertainty. On the other end of the line, I listened in silence. Not out of indifference, but because, in that moment, I understood that the true legacy wasn't in the properties. It was in what it all represented: trust, continuity, restoration. But Joshua, as always, went further. The next day, he appeared at my door with an envelope in his hands and that look in his eyes that said more than any speech. He sat on the sofa, as he had as a boy, and began to speak with an almost childlike lightness, but with the firmness of a man who understands the value of what he carries. "Grandma, I know how much this cost. I know what Grandpa did for me, but also for you. And I know that if I can receive all of this today, it's because you had the courage to open that drawer, to face everything, to not keep quiet. So, this here," he handed me the envelope, "is yours, back, in life." I opened it slowly. Inside were the documents transferring some of the properties Henry had protected back into my name. He could have kept it all. No one would judge him. But he chose to share. Not out of obligation, but out of conscience. I looked at him and felt an overflowing pride. Because in that moment, I saw more than a grandson. I saw a man shaped by values that had stood the test of time, that had survived lies, and that now flourished with integrity. That night, I didn't fall asleep for a long time. I sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the street, feeling the wind touch my face. I thought about everything I'd experienced, everything I'd endured in silence, and everything I'd resolved to change. That's when Joshua, in his simple way, suggested, "You should record this, Grandma. Not the whole story, but just a message, a piece. For anyone who's been through something similar. For anyone who thinks it's too late." It took me a while, but I agreed. The next day, phone in hand and heart racing, I sat on the living room couch, the same one where I'd cried silently, where I'd rocked my children, where I'd imagined the end and, unknowingly, found a new beginning. I took a deep breath, looked straight into the camera, and spoke in the strongest voice I could muster. "If you've been forgotten, know this: you still have strength within you. They just extinguished your light for a while. But you still shine." It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't written. It came out as if it came from the center of my soul. Because I knew there were others like me. Other silent voices. Other women who spent their lives making space for others and forgetting themselves. Women who mistook silence for peace. Who accepted solitude as punishment, when in truth it was just a reflection of the injustice of those who failed to see their worth. And there, in that moment, looking directly into the camera, I wasn't just Eleanor. I was a reflection of all those who had once been pushed into the background of their own story. Who were told they were too old, too fragile, too confused. Who were reduced to stereotypes while carrying the weight of generations on their shoulders. No, I didn't want applause. Or revenge. What I wanted was to leave a message. A reminder. That each of us carries a key. Sometimes small, rusty, forgotten in the back of a drawer. But at the right moment, it can open doors no one else could. Because when truth meets courage, it doesn't ask for permission. It enters. It transforms. It heals. And even with my heart scarred, I'm living proof that it's still possible to rebuild, to rewrite, to rekindle the light they tried to extinguish. There was still one thing I needed to do. One final gesture, a symbolic closure, but one that carried within itself everything this journey had meant. I knew exactly where it was stored, and what it could still unlock. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story resonated with you. Maybe it was the journey. Maybe it was the courage to start over. Or just that feeling that, even when it seems too late, there's still a forgotten key waiting to be used. If this content found you at the right time, if it resonated with you in some way, subscribe to the channel. We're creating a space for stories that deserve to be heard, and yours could be one of them, too. Leave the phrase "this message was for me" in the comments, just so I know you stuck with me until the end. Knowing there's someone on the other side, feeling this together, makes everything have more meaning. And if this video resonated with you, please leave a like, not because of the algorithm, but because of the silent connection we've created here. This shows me it's worth continuing. There's a video right here that complements all of this in a special way. Click and continue with me there. The conversation isn't over yet.